of New York Presbyterian, Daniel Barchi, who will be interviewed by HITLAB Executive Director, John Hammitt. Over to you, John. Thank you both for joining us.
Well, Justin, thank you. And I want to say that this is a distinct pleasure. Also, it's not going to be an interview so much as a conversation. I'd like to welcome Daniel Barchi, who's the Senior Vice President, CIO of New York Presbyterian. He's a leading healthcare technology exec, and we'll ask him to talk a little bit more about his background, which is broad and includes things like institutional investment, private equity, turnaround and restructuring, which is a fun portfolio of things to have experience. He also represents New York Presbyterian, which is one of the nation's largest and most comprehensive hospitals, leading in patient care, scientific discoveries, and medical education. And with a little bit of bragging from the Northeast, #1 in New York City and #4 in the US. So Daniel, welcome. Looking forward to the next few minutes where we have a chance to explore both who you are, what you've done, and most importantly, how New York Presbyterian is serving the populations it serves. So why don't we begin with maybe a little bit about who you are and where you've come from, and tell us a bit more about the hospital before we get into some of our topics.
Sure. Well, thanks, John. Thanks for having me. And it's a pleasure to be here. And it's an honor to follow Michelle, who's really made a name for herself in nursing and nursing informatics. I'm Daniel Barchi. I'm the Chief Information Officer of New York Presbyterian. Very briefly on background, I served as a naval officer for about 7 years, got out of the Navy and became a project manager in the telecommunications industry. Had a number of successfully larger roles until I got a call from a hospital in Roanoke, Virginia, saying, hey, we understand you do turnaround in the telecommunications industry. We need somebody to come turn around a biomedical institute. So based on my extensive biomedical engineering experience, I got a B in high school biology. I went and ran a biomedical institute for a couple of years, turned it around, and then got a call from the CEO one day that said, hey, we need you to be our CIO. So I just stepped into CIO role at the Korean Health System with no technology experience. That was about 15 years ago. I've been a CIO at Korean in Virginia, then at Yale, and now I've been here at New York Presbyterian for about 5 years. New York Presbyterian is a teaching hospital for Columbia and Weill Cornell. So we work for 2 Ivy League medical schools. The #4 hospital in the nation. We have 11 campuses. We have about $9 billion in gross revenue every year. We have about 47,000 employees. And for the past year, you all been following us. We've all been living it. We've been fighting the battle of our lives with COVID. And I'm really proud of what we've been doing for the past year.
Well, that's a heck of an introduction. And with you having been in the Navy, I don't know whether to salute or just say yes, sir, when you speak. But what I'd like to do is set up the conversation for the next few minutes, because as you've already alluded, we can't ignore the fact that the last year has been unexpected and one heck of a challenging journey for everybody, not just those of us in healthcare, but for the worldwide population. But it seems to me that there are 4 things that you've done extraordinarily well with the hospital, and I'd like to have you talk a little bit about each one of them, and we'll kind of explore them and maybe dig a little more deeply. But one is, how did you go about turning around operating rooms and quickly creating the ICU capacity that was necessary to deal with the accelerating and evolving pandemic? Secondly, at the same time, being a very large, complex organization, you had to accelerate the rollout of Epic as a tool to help run the organization and support the clinical experience throughout. As we've come to the end of this phase of the pandemic, we ended the point where vaccination is becoming a much more important part of serving the population. You've put up a vaccination site that now serves over almost 5,000 vaccinations daily. And throughout that, the most important characteristic of Presbyterian, I think, is the fact that patient communications continues to be at the center of both the supporting the populations and talking to the people that you serve in the various therapeutic needs. So let's try to cover those 4 topics over the next few minutes. But why don't we start at the top with ORs into ICUs, because I think that's, given the urgency of the past situation, that's got to be a very intriguing topic.
Great, I'm happy to. You know, in February of last year, when we saw what was coming and we started to see our first few patients, I had the analytics team prepare a forecast of what we might see. Analytics reports up to IT, as does biomedical engineering and a number of other things. And our analytics team told us that we should expect an influx of patients, especially critically ill patients. And when we looked at the number of ICU beds that we would need, which we estimated to be about 1,100 versus the number of ICU beds that we had, which was about 400 at the time, we clearly saw an issue. So I had the biomedical engineering team beginning to work with the chief operating officers at every one of our campuses to do everything we could to turn our clinically intensive space into ICUs. So we would go, for instance, at our Columbia University Medical Center, we'd go in and we'd shut down a whole wing of operating rooms, and we would bring in additional equipment. And where there was one bed in an operating room, we would add 2 or 3 other beds and then bring in the monitors and the pumps and the ventilators and turn that OR into, instead of a single OR, into a 3 or 4 bed ICU. And we did that over and over again at every one of our 10 clinical campuses, so that by the end of it, we had approximately 900 ICU beds that were available to us to meet our clinical need. It was fortunate, we got very close. I think we topped out at 885 ventilated ICU patients. So we were always able to stay one step ahead of it. But as precise as medicine can be, I'll tell you what got us through this, and it was a lot of innovative, thoughtful people. So I've got a great IT team, I've got a great biomedical engineering team, and a lot of them are physicians and doctors themselves. And they worked every way they could to find equipment, to repurpose equipment, create processes and protocols for these new ICU rooms, so we're able to take care of patients in a really safe manner, and it's something that we're very proud of.
Well, what you've described is a very urgent campaign to kind of create capacity out of existing facilities. But I'm curious now, as there's at least early indications that the pandemic and the rate at which patients are needing ICU capability is declining, or at least leveling off, is the reverse of that going to be equally effective? I mean, how do you now go back to creating a OR out of a former ICU?
That's a great question. For the most part, we've dismantled this capability, but retained the ability to stand them up quickly. So we've created a new capacity to flip a room within 24 hours from being a PACU or an OR or an ED into an ICU. So we've got the equipment. We're actually very proud of the fact that we built a clinical depot in New Jersey. So we've got thousands of pieces of equipment. So we're ready to stand up in just hours and days notice to meet the next crisis or pandemic, be it a pandemic in our hospitals or a weather condition or event or some type of natural disaster to create hospitals elsewhere. So we've added that as an enterprise risk mitigator in the meantime. To go back to the numbers, when I said we had about 885 ICU patients at the height of COVID, I'd say in mid-April of 2020, at the same time, we had about 4,000 patients in our regular hospital beds. So 4,000 total, of whom 885 were in the ICUs. So that was clearly a huge influx of patients. We may have at one point had more COVID positive patients in our hospitals than any other health system in the nation. Right now, in the most recent wave, we peaked out just short of 1,000. Right now, we're at about 850 COVID positive patients, of whom about 85 are in ICU. So it was anywhere from 15 to 30% of our patients who were critically ill and in ICUs before. Now it's about 10%. We don't see that climbing. So we're maintaining our capability, what we learned from it, but we're not having to stand up as many ICUs as we did before.
Well, that's a great story, and you know, I think that it will be fun to kind of sit down a year from now and talk about both how it was accomplished and then how we get back to normal, or at least begin to approach normalcy. So I look forward to staying in touch on that. But being someone who experienced a bit of leadership in the IT world of healthcare myself, you know, to think about in process of serving, you know, the dramatic imposing needs of trying to deal with COVID, you also have the problem of trying to roll out Epic during the pandemic. And, large institutional systems are never rolled out gracefully in the best of times. I can't imagine how it must have been in the toughest of times. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what some of the challenges were, and most importantly, why that was necessary. Because, this is always a question of me. Can't we put something aside and solve the big problem? And you were trying to solve the big problem while you're also solving another big problem.
That's a good point. We recognized several years ago that we were not integrated in the way that we wanted to be. So between our three institutions, Columbia, Weill Cornell, and New York Presbyterian, we determined that we had 9 different electronic medical records, and that's no way to run a railroad. So we began in 2016 a plan to integrate down to a single EMR, and we chose Epic together. So we have a several $100 million project to standardize on Epic. We were really fortunate, and all the preparation that we did allowed us to go live at Columbia, the first of our 4 major go lives, on February 1st of 2020. We had our first COVID positive patient in-house almost exactly a month later on March 2nd of 2020. So we were able to go live at our first major go live on Epic and have 30 days of normal runway afterwards before Epic started to heat up. Our second major go live had been planned for October 31st of 2020, so Halloween. And at first, when we were in the height of the pandemic crisis in March and April, we thought there's no way we're going to go live on time, never mind even in this year. But what we recognized was the benefits of being on a common platform were so important that we needed to find out any way we could to keep on time for go live. And then as we were able to get through the worst of the crisis in April and got into May and June, we thought, you know what, we're not just going to go live on time at the end of October. We're going to accelerate this because we don't know if there will be a second wave. And it turned out that there was a second wave. But we didn't want to be in the midst of a second wave trying to take our second major go live, Weill Cornell Medical Center, live. So we accelerated the date by 4 weeks. And instead of October 31st, we went live on October 2nd with a huge big bang again. Just like the first one, it was about 15,000 physicians and clinicians, about 5,000 other people, thousands of hours of training, thousands of hours of support staff. And despite the fact that everyone was very tired and very busy, we were able to go live early and safely, and that was a success. Now we're having the same challenge. We've got go live 3 and 4 this year on June 4th and December 3rd. And we're hoping that the amount of COVID in our hospitals and the focus of our clinicians has decreased to the point where we can go live for a 3rd time in June and for a 4th time in December, and then we'll be done the entire rollout. But I'll answer your question ahead of time, John. A lot of good focus and a lot of good coordination by talented people made this happen and got it done safely.
Well, it's again another story that probably should be documented at some point, and might even, if not a good book, at least turn into a good report. We've got a couple of quick topics that we want to wrap up with. There's like 5, 6, 7 minutes left. The one that intrigues me, frankly, the most is putting up the mass vaccination site, because it's a significant problem to put up a site in which you're going to be having thousands of vaccinations a day. I mean, that's just logistics and facilities management and process management. But it has to be done, or it had to be done, in the context of public policy and public health care systems, in which the people to be vaccinated were organized and put into the pipeline that you've dealt with. And then most importantly, as they went through there, those connections back to the public systems had to work. So I'd like to really hear about that, because we've all heard about some states and facilities work great, others didn't work at all, and you seem to have kind of threaded the needle with putting it in place to making it work. So I'd like to hear about that.
So I'll share a couple of things. One, we wanted to serve our patients and our community, and we wanted to vaccinate as many people as we could. We had great partners in New York City and New York State. So New York State and New York City are doing a remarkable job getting vaccine, distributing it, keeping track of it, and coordinating a number of sites, both large vaccination sites and pop-up sites. And I think we can really be proud as New Yorkers of the way this has all happened. We wanted to play our part, and we were looking for a large place to do a rollout. Now, if you live in the suburbs, you can do it in, I don't know, in a convention center or in a large parking lot, or in nice weather areas like Los Angeles, you can do it in Dodger Stadium. in Manhattan, we don't have that kind of space. And so we thought about it, and really the only space we have is something like what I'm in right now. It's the Armory up at 169th Street in Fort Washington in the Washington Heights area, and it's right across the street from Columbia. So we focused all of our efforts, and in about 3 or 4 days, we put together a plan and all the infrastructure to run a large vaccination site. We built the technology infrastructure within Epic to schedule all of our patients. And now we've been running for about 5 or 6 weeks, vaccinating anywhere from 2,000 to 4,500 patients every day. I'll give you a quick tour of it. I'm actually sitting in the bleachers of the Armory right now. What you see around me is some of the vaccinators who are taking a break for lunch or resting after working all day. But if you can look down here, you see the track of the Armory. You see people down there being registered at the tables, and on the inside of the track is where all the vaccination sites are. Each one of our 72 vaccination stations, people go in there and get vaccinated, and then they sit on the floor of the track in individual chairs, and we have 300 chairs out there to monitor them for 15 or 30 minutes. And while they're being monitored, somebody walks up with a workstation on wheels and schedules them for their second vaccination. So everybody who comes in here leaves with their second vaccination appointment so they can come back on time right here to the Armory 3 weeks later. So I'm proud of what we've done, mostly though proud that we're doing it in Washington Heights, which is a neighborhood which has a lot of people of color, a lot of people who speak Spanish, and we've managed to maintain well over 60% of all of our vaccinations going to the local community. I'm sure you've heard stories nationally of people from the suburbs flocking into vaccination sites and overwhelming local communities. In our case, we've been really focused on meeting the local needs of our communities. We've hired many Spanish-speaking people. We've hired interpreters so that we're able not only to be efficient and quality from a vaccination point of view, but to serve the people in this community as well.
Well, you know, that was a stunning story, but the picture was worth 10,000 words when you kind of put the magnitude of the operation in place. And I think it's also interestingly, you know, the reality of healthcare today, because a lot of our conversations throughout this symposium have been about the exciting possibilities, the exciting new opportunities, the promising technologies, you know, the combination of wow and shiny objects that we were all pursuing, you know, across the spectrum of healthcare. But you just had a profound example of the day-to-day reality of delivering healthcare in volume, one person at a time. And I think we can't lose sight of that as we continue to explore the power of digital opportunities, that it still boils down to one patient, one therapeutic intervention, and one institutional solution to try to keep that patient alive and well, and most importantly, prospering. So, so thanks for that whack in the head and reminder that healthcare is about people. And that kind of brings us to the final topic, which was patient communications. You know, one of the hallmarks of Presbyterian, for me, and I think for the people that it serves, is its extraordinary culture and commitment to communications about the possibilities of what the hospital system can provide, but then more importantly, the communications on an individual basis about who are you and what are you here for and how do we best help you. And so I guess I'd like to wrap up in the next minute or so about talk about patient communications, both from the culture point of view, what drives that, and then most importantly, what are the capabilities that puts a demand on for the solutions that you have to build up and institutionalize.
Well, thanks for asking, John. I lead technology for New York Presbyterian, but I often say that healthcare is 80% people, 15% process, and only 5% technology. The technology is the easy part. The 80% people is the hard and the important part. We've seen it in the Armory. We could have gone about this like an engineering process, but instead we focused on it like a human process. And through all of COVID and through vaccinations, we've recognized we needed to use our technology not just to get things done, but to tell people what we were doing and share information with them so they felt safe and knew we were doing quality work. So in addition to the kind of work we're doing where we're actively communicating through websites that we've stood up, like vaccinetogetherny.org, to share with patients what's happening from a vaccination point of view. We've gone and done outreach to our patients. We've set up an additional capability to do texting and emailing directly with our patients to keep them live in near real time with our partners, Weill Cornell and Columbia, so everybody knows what's happening and has equitable and fair access to all the resources we're offering.
Well, Dan, this has been a fun and very fast 20 minutes. So I appreciate your commitment to spending this time with us. I look forward to catching up face to face at either your or my favorite watering hole in New York once the the pandemic removes its dark hand from us. And thank you very much.